Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'd like to thank Andrew for inviting me to speak. We've been watching the new TV series of Les Miserables. That may be something that you've seen. We think it's fantastic, and you might know Les Miserables from the musical version, which was very popular, or from the 4-inch fat book, which is quite a tome to read, but is really fantastic. But Les Miserables is a story about some very ordinary people in some very hard times. And it is a story that really focuses on two things, and they are, first of all, God's grace, and second, human kindness, which is very much like the story of Ruth in the Bible, isn't it? And actually, Ruth would make a great mini-series for TV. It kind of has everything, all the romance and the friendship and the terrible struggles, all those sorts of things. So Ruth, I think, is a little bit like Les Miserables. Now, we're going to have 4 sermons in Ruth. I get to do number 1. And I'm not going to give it all away, although it would be easy to do that, but I might give you some trailers or some ads for the upcoming episodes, if you like. What we have in Ruth chapter 1 is what you might call the setup for the rest of the story. And there are 3 big things that the story is setting up for us. First of all, the losses. Second of all, the choices. And third, the challenge. Let's look first of all at the losses. Naomi is the first character that we meet, and she has had plenty of losses. We find out that 10 years prior, she moved with her husband and 2 sons to a foreign country, Moab. They moved from Israel because they had suffered quite a lot in a famine. And while they were over there, the boys grew up, they got married, there were no grandchildren, and then 3 deaths, 1, 2, 3, straight after the other. And Naomi is left in a foreign country with no one except these 2 daughters-in-law who aren't from where she's from, and really no future to speak of. Here's a side note. Interestingly, the Bible speaks very clearly of famine in Israel at that time being a definite consequence of disobedience to God. Israel had sinned in some way, and they had copped their punishment, which was a famine. Now, Naomi and her husband, who had suffered in the famine, had decided to get out, rather than stay and do the work of repentance with their community, so to make God pleased with them again. Also, Israelites were very firmly discouraged from marrying foreign women, and her sons did exactly that. So you could make the argument that Naomi is not the most faithful Israelite of all time. Now, whether or not those things happened out of her choice or she's a victim of circumstances, we don't really know. But for whatever reason, you wouldn't call her the ideal Israelite living by God's laws. But back to the story. Naomi sees no future for herself in Moab, and when she hears that things are better in Israel, she makes a decision. Which brings us to the second part of the setup, the choices. Naomi makes a choice. Her choice is between really a no future at all in Moab, this foreign country, and slightly better odds in Israel, the place she left before, now that she hears that things are slightly on the up over there. She might not have any income when she gets back or anyone to look after her, but at least the crops are growing from what she hears. And so she chooses to head home. And this is where we meet Ruth and Orpah, the 2 daughters-in-law. Ruth is one of the daughters-in-law. And in that time, if your mother-in-law decided to move to Queensland, you also had to move to Queensland. We don't have that kind of relationship with our mother-in-law these days. If your mother-in-law wants to move to Queensland, she can go ahead and do it, and you don't have to go with her. But in those days, Ruth and Orpah were very strongly tied for cultural reasons to their mother-in-law, and so her decision became, by default, their decision. So off they go, the 3 of them, all heading back to Israel. Now, on the road, Naomi thinks about it from their point of view. And she thinks, you know what? These ladies do not have a great future with me. And so she gives them an opportunity to free themselves, sort of dismantle their connection, if you like. I'm going to paraphrase. She basically says, look, you girls have a terrible future ahead of you if you stick with me. I can't give you what you need. What you need is a husband. It's impossible for me to give you that. So she says, you should go back home. You should go back to the people you know, go back to your gods, just start again. And there are two choices that are made here. Orpah decides that she will go back home. She'll go back to her parents' place, start again with her people and her gods. Ruth, however, makes a totally different choice. And I've often wondered what sort of background Ruth actually came from, what sort of family she had, that she would take such a huge risk and go to a foreign country with this woman who she hadn't known really that long, but leaving everything familiar behind. Would she really choose an unknown future that didn't promise a whole lot over the place that she had known and was familiar? It's interesting. But it turns out that two things were very important as she made the choice. First of all was Naomi herself. They must have been very close because there's a lot of clinging and weeping and hugging and things that we aren't allowed to do in these days of COVID. Whatever kindness Naomi had already shown Ruth in their relationship was actually bearing fruit, because Ruth was not going to leave. She says to Naomi, "Your people will be my people." And the second thing that was important in her choice was Naomi's God, Yahweh. "Your God will be my God," she said. She must have seen enough of Naomi's God and Naomi's faith and Naomi's beliefs and the way Naomi lived to be willing to hitch herself to this God who was not her God and start a new life as one of his people. So off they go into the third part of the setup for this first episode of the mini-series of Ruth and Naomi. And the third part is the challenge. So Ruth and Naomi land back in Israel, in Bethlehem, which is going to be the birthplace of a very important person, although they don't know that yet. It hasn't happened yet. In they come, this bedraggled duo of two really unimportant Israelite people, two widows. One is not known for her faithfulness to God. She ditched them, got out of there before. The other is a foreigner, hardly someone who's A-list. Between them, they have no property, no plans, and no real close people who are going to look after them. And one of them is very angry, and that's Naomi, of course. Everyone who knew her from 10 years ago comes out to say, "Whoa, is it really her? Is she really back?" And they come out and they have a little gather to hear what she's got to say. Where's she been? What's she done? Why's she come back? And what she has to say is not exactly what you'd call fun listening. It's kind of a tale of woe and a tale of bitterness. So bitter, in fact, that she says she's changing her name. Naomi, her name, means pleasant. And she says, "There's nothing pleasant about my life. You can all call me from now on Mara." It means bitter. And then she launches into what these days we would call a rant. Quite a long rant too. The words she uses to describe herself and her life are these: empty, tragedy, bitter, suffering. And here's who she says is behind it. "The Lord has made my life, blah, blah, blah. The Lord has brought me, blah, blah, blah. The Lord has caused such, blah, blah, blah. The Almighty has sent this, da, da, da." In other words, she's saying, I hurt badly and God is behind it. And it's a challenge. It's probably the challenge of the whole of the story of Ruth and Naomi, the whole of the Bible book. It's this question: is God kind if he lets these terrible things happen to Naomi? And it's a very real question for all of us. In the face of loss and grief and emptiness and suffering and bushfires and floods and COVID, and you can name all the rest in your life if you like, in the face of injustice, is God actually kind? And is he sovereign and in charge? Now, all of that comes in verse 21 of chapter 1. It's this massive challenge, this massive question that the rest of the story is going to answer. Is God really who he says he is? Will he provide? Will there be a future? Now, one of the great secrets of script writing is that you always leave an audience wondering, waiting, wishing, hoping, thinking what's going to happen next. Let's look at verse 22, because there's the hint of hope. Naomi rants in verse 21, God has made me suffer. And in verse 22, what does it say? The barley harvest is beginning. Something's going to happen. Something's going to happen. Now, I said that in like Les Miserables, Ruth was a story of grace and kindness. And I think in chapter 1, Naomi would certainly argue that there hasn't been a lot of God's grace, but isn't there a lot of kindness already that we can see? We see it in Ruth and Naomi's relationship for a start. Naomi has obviously shown kindness to her young daughter-in-law over the years, and Ruth repays it in spades by making that choice, quite a difficult choice, to ditch everything behind her and to come with her mother-in-law. Her choice shows kindness, her support of Naomi shows kindness, and later what we get to see is that her kindness to Naomi helps Naomi out later on as she sort of gains energy and momentum as well. Here's another side note. What an odd choice God, the great scriptwriter, made, putting Ruth into this story as its main character. After all, she was from Moab, wasn't she? A foreigner. Moabites were Israel's enemies. Not exactly the sort of person you'd expect God to choose to be part of the line of his chosen king David and then ultimately Jesus. But it's interesting, Ruth has three things going for her. First of all, she is a widow, and God has a great heart for widows and the vulnerable in life. Second, she's a landless alien in Israel, also vulnerable, and God has a huge heart for those people who don't belong. Third of all, most importantly, Ruth made a choice to leave her gods and follow Yahweh, the God. And she followed up the choice with actions, and God loves it when people choose to be in a relationship with him. But back to the story. This episode is now over, and what we're going to see in the future episodes or chapters are these things. We're going to see the fruit of kindness, the natural results of what happens when people are kind to each other. And one of those is the inspiring, firm friendship that benefits both Ruth and Naomi, even though they're so different from different countries with different languages, different ages, different backgrounds. They have this friendship which endures. It's almost bigger than they are. We're also going to see God's kindness start to come into play, answering Naomi's challenge to him. And one way will be to see the provision that he actually had already made for Ruth and Naomi centuries ago in setting up the laws of Israel that allowed things like gleaning at harvest time, provision for the vulnerable. God's kindness will be very clearly seen. We're going to see, obviously, what we're all waiting for is the slightly oddball romance that happens with Ruth and Boaz. He's not exactly a white knight galloping in to save the day. He's more of a sort of sandal-wearing redeemer. But he does save the day, and he does end up providing for Ruth and Naomi. Again, another answer to Naomi's big challenge. And what we're going to see is how God used Ruth and Naomi's difficult story, difficult suffering, in his plan to save the world through the ultimate Redeemer, who is Jesus. Now, unlike Andrew and I, who can watch Les Miserables whenever we like, we could binge fest the whole series if we wanted to, one episode after the other. Unfortunately, you don't get to do 4 episodes of Ruth all in a row. You have to wait till next week when the next sermon is preached. But what you can do is go back and read the whole book of Ruth. And you might like to ask yourself these 5 questions. First of all, would you, like Ruth, have made that choice to follow Yahweh into an unseen future, completely foreign land, with someone who wasn't really your people? Would you have made that choice? Or are you a little bit like me? I like to see what I'm getting before I commit. Number 2, do you continually make the same choice, like Ruth, to make God's people your people and to make God your God? Here's the third question. How are we doing at showing kindness in the small daily things of life? That kindness bears fruit. Number 4, would we have a similar rant to God about God in the hard things of life? Or are we practicing looking at his provision, which is there, and thanking him for it, especially the provision of salvation through Christ? And finally, fifth, do we look to our Redeemer Jesus to bring us a future and a hope? I hope you enjoy reading Ruth, and I look forward to what is to come in the mini-series.